Here's something nobody wants to say out loud. The most visible player in women's basketball, right now, might also be the most misunderstood. And that gap between what people think they're seeing and what's actually happening, that's the whole story. Let's go back, not to the highlights, not to the viral moments, but to the weight she walked into this league carrying. When Caitlin Clark left Iowa, she wasn't just leaving college basketball behind. She was leaving the only world where people had context for what she was doing. In college, the numbers made sense. The range made sense. The crowds made sense. Everyone understood the scale. Then the WNBA happened, and suddenly, the same things that made her extraordinary felt controversial. The expectations didn't travel cleanly. They got distorted somewhere between the draft night applause and the first regular season tip-off. What arrived in Indiana wasn't just a basketball player. It was a phenomenon wrapped in pressure, dropped into a league that had been operating at its own elite level long, before anyone outside it was paying attention. That mattered a lot because the WNBA wasn't waiting for her to arrive. It had stars. It had systems. It had veterans who'd been grinding for years without a fraction of the spotlight she walked in with. And those players, some of the best athletes in the world, weren't about to make room just because the cameras followed her in. She had to earn room. That's not a criticism. That's just the truth. And earning it looked ugly at first. The rookie year was real, but it was raw. The turnovers were real. The adjustment was real. There were stretches where the game moved faster than her reads could keep up with, where defenders crowded her space and dared her to figure it out in real time on national television, with everyone watching. Some nights she did. Some nights she didn't. What made it harder was that neither outcome ever got a neutral reaction. When she struggled, the narrative was obvious. She can't handle this level. When she succeeded, a different critique quietly surfaced. Is she actually making her teammates better? Or is this just shooting? There was no clean win. Every performance got filtered through whatever story someone had already decided to tell about her. The criticism was loud, but what was louder in a strange way was the expectation that she needed to be perfect immediately. Not good, not developing. Perfect, transcendent from game one. Carrying a franchise and a movement and a narrative all at once, while still figuring out how to guard a WNBA 2 guard and run a half-court offense against switching defenses she'd never seen before. That's not a normal standard. That's an impossible one. And here's what gets buried underneath all of it. The Indiana Fever weren't good before she got there. They weren't a piece away from contention. They were a team that had been rebuilding for years, trying to figure out an identity, cycling through rosters that never quite clicked. Clark didn't arrive into a situation built for her. She arrived into a situation that needed to be built around her. That's a different challenge entirely. Most young players, even great ones, develop inside systems that already work. They slot in, they learn, they grow. Clark was being asked to grow and lead and market and develop and produce, all simultaneously, on a team still finding its own footing. The fact that she stayed upright through all of it was, on its own, kind of remarkable, but nobody wanted to frame it that way. The conversation was always about whether she was living up to the hype, not about what it actually takes to carry that much noise while still learning how to play at this level. That framing mattered, because it meant that even when she was doing something genuinely impressive, people kept measuring it against an impossible version of her they'd already constructed in their heads. And now, heading deeper into her career, that constructed version is finally starting to crack, because what she's doing right now doesn't fit the story anymore. There's a moment in every great player's career that doesn't get announced. No press conference, no highlight package, no slow motion montage set to dramatic music. It's quieter than that, almost invisible. But if you're watching closely enough, really watching, you can see the exact moment a player stops reacting to game and starts dictating it. For Caitlin Clark, that moment didn't happen in one game. It happened gradually, across a stretch of performances that most casual viewers didn't even realize they were watching differently. But something had shifted, something fundamental. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The first sign wasn't her scoring. It was her patience. That sounds small. It isn't. In her early WNBA appearances, there was an urgency to her game, that made sense given the circumstances. She was pressing, proving, trying to justify every expectation in real time. When a play broke down, she forced the next one into existence. When a defense took something away, she fought to get it back immediately. That's what rookies do. That's what most players do when they're playing scared. Not scared of failing, but scared of being seen as the thing people said they were. But at some point, that urgency started dissolving. And what replaced it was something far more dangerous. Composure. Not the fake kind. Not the, I'm staying calm on the surface while panicking underneath kind. Real composure. The kind where you see the double team developing 2 seconds before it arrives, and you've already decided what you're going to do with it before it gets there. The read started changing first. Where she used to see 1 pass, she started seeing 3. Where she used to look for her shot and settle for the assist, she started weaponizing the threat of her shot to create the assist, which is actually a completely different skill set. That's not passing. That's manipulation. That's using what defenders fear about you to open up things they didn't plan to give up. That's point guard thinking at its highest level. And it started showing up everywhere. Pick and roll coverages that used to give her trouble started looking like opportunities. Defenders who cheated toward her shooting hand started getting punished going left. Hard hedges that were designed to disrupt her rhythm started getting used against the teams running them, because she'd learned how to make the recovery man pay. She was solving the chess problems the league kept setting for her, and she was solving them faster each time. The shooting didn't disappear. Let's be clear about that. The shooting was never the question. It was always the answer, but now it was functioning differently. It wasn't the first option on every possession anymore. It was a weapon she held in her back pocket while she went to work doing everything else. And when she did pull it out, defenses weren't ready because they had just spent the whole possession worried about what she was going to do before the shot. That's the evolution that casual fans miss entirely. They see a big shooting night and call a hot streak. What they're not seeing is the 25 minutes of decision-making that set the whole thing up, the passes that stretched the defense, the movements off the ball that forced rotations, the moments where she deliberately didn't shoot, so that the moment she did, it was already open. That's not a hot streak. That's architecture. But here's the part that actually tells you how real this leap is. It showed up on bad nights too. That's the test most people forget to apply. Any player can look transformed when everything is going right. When shots are falling, when teammates are hitting their cuts, when the other team is a step slow. The real question is what happens when none of that is true? What happens when the shot isn't falling? What happens when the defense has done its homework and actually taken away the things she wants? Because that's when you find out what a player is actually made of. And what Clark started showing, quietly, without making a big deal of it, was that she could still impact games when her own game wasn't working. That's not a small thing. That's actually everything. The box score wouldn't always tell you about it. Some nights the points weren't there, but the assists were. Some nights neither number jumped off the page, but the Fever won anyway. And if you went back and watched, you could trace the win back to 3 or 4 moments where her decision-making changed the possession entirely. That's the kind of player she was becoming. Not a statistic, not a highlight, a problem. The kind of problem that doesn't go away when you take one thing from her, because she's already figured out how to beat you with something else. And the league was starting to feel it. When a player truly levels up, the first ones who know it aren't the fans. It's not the analysts. It's not the media. It's not the people writing the takes or running the highlight accounts. It's the coaches on the other sideline. Because coaches don't have the luxury of narrative. They don't get to decide what they believe about a player based on reputation or storyline. They have to deal with what's actually in front of them. And what was increasingly in front of opposing coaches was a problem they didn't have a clean answer for. That's when you know something real is happening. The defensive scheme started changing. That's always the tell. Early in her career, teams had a relatively standard approach to guarding Clark. Pressure her early, make her work off the dribble, take away the quick pull-up, make her prove she can create off movement instead of space. It worked. Not always, but enough. Then it stopped working as consistently. And when a scheme stops working, coaches have 2 choices, double down or adapt. Most teams started adapting, and the adaptations got complicated fast. Some teams went under screens, daring her to shoot off the catch. She made them pay. Some teams went over every single screen, gambling that the extra pressure would disrupt her rhythm. She used the momentum of those coverages to get downhill. Some teams switched everything, tried to eliminate the mismatch opportunities. She started hunting the switches herself, engineering the exact matchup she wanted before the ball even moved. There was no free option. Every choice had a cost. That's the mark of a player who has genuinely figured something out. Not that she's unstoppable, but that stopping her always requires a sacrifice. And whatever you sacrifice, she's going to find it. But the ripple effect went beyond schemes. Way beyond. Think about what her presence on the floor actually does to a defense structurally. A defender who respects her range cannot sag. Full stop. They have to stay attached, which means they can't help as freely on drives from her teammates, which means the paint opens up, which means the Fever's bigs are getting looks they wouldn't otherwise get, which means weak side rotations are slower, because everyone is slightly out of position trying to account for where she is. One player, creating geometry. That's not a small contribution to a team's offense. That's arguably the most valuable thing a guard can do. Make the defense pay for paying attention to you, even when you don't have the ball. And she was doing it consistently enough that the Fever's offense started looking structurally different. Not just better because she was scoring, better because the spacing she demanded changed what was available for everyone else. Her teammates noticed. Of course they did. There's a specific kind of trust that builds in a locker room around a player who makes you better. It's different from the trust you have for someone who scores a lot. Scores are valuable, obviously, but the player who consistently puts you in a better position, who makes your job easier without asking for credit, that player earns something deeper. And the Fever were starting to play like a team that trusted what she was setting up for them. That's an intangible that doesn't show up in any box score, but it shows up in the way a team moves, in the way they cut without hesitation, in the way they shoot without flinching, because they've learned that if she's finding them, the shot is usually a good one. That's culture. That's what a real point guard builds. And then there's the broader thing, the thing that goes beyond Indiana entirely. Caitlin Clark's dominance, and at this point, that's the right word for it, isn't just impacting the Fever, it's impacting the entire ecosystem of the league. Attendance numbers shifted, viewership shifted, the conversations happening around women's basketball shifted. But here's what gets missed in all of that noise. The players around the league got better too. Not because of her exactly, but because of what her presence demanded. When one player raises the standard of what's expected, from a point guard, from a floor general, from a franchise centerpiece, everyone operating at that level has to respond. Other teams had to recruit differently, had to develop guards differently, had to think about playmaking in ways the league hadn't collectively prioritized in the same way before. She didn't just change her team. She changed the competitive calculus of the whole league. That's a different conversation than hype. Hype is noise. Hype is attention without substance. Hype fades the second results stop matching the story. What Clark was generating wasn't hype anymore. It was gravity, the kind that pulls everything else in the orbit around it into a new alignment. Teams were building rosters differently because of how they'd need to guard her. Coaches were designing defensive systems with her specifically in mind. Scouts were evaluating players through a lens that her game had helped sharpen. One player, reshaping how the whole league thinks. And still, somehow, the full weight of that wasn't landing in the public conversation. The story was still stuck somewhere between, is she worth the hype? And, okay, but what are her numbers? As if the numbers were ever going to be the complete picture. They weren't. They aren't. And the people who understood that were watching something unfold that the box score crowd was going to be very late to understand. Here's something that should bother you more than it probably does. There's a version of Caitlin Clark's career that, if it belonged to someone else, would already be universally celebrated. No asterisks. No qualifiers. No, but here's the concern. Just celebration. And the fact that it isn't, the fact that the criticism has followed her stubbornly, almost regardless of what she produces. That tells you something important. Not about her, about the conversation itself. Let's name the criticisms directly, because they didn't go away. They evolved. First it was, She's overhyped. She's a college star who won't translate. Then, when she translated, it became, okay, but is she efficient enough? Then when the efficiency improved, it shifted to, her defense is a liability. Then when she showed defensive improvement, the conversation pivoted to, but what does she do in the biggest moments? Notice the pattern. The goalpost didn't stay still. Every time she cleared a bar, the bar quietly moved somewhere else. And the people moving it never acknowledged they were doing it. They just introduced the next concern, as if it had always been the real one. That's not analysis. That's something else entirely. The defense criticism is worth spending real time on, because it became the loudest sustained critique, and it deserves an honest look. Yes, she was targeted defensively early in her career. That's true. Opponents went at her, made her uncomfortable, exposed the gaps between her instincts and what the pro game required. But here's what that framing leaves out. Almost every guard coming into the WNBA faces defensive growing pains. It's not unique to her. The speed is different. The physicality is different. The way screens are set and the way cutters move. All of it takes time to read correctly at this level. The difference is that when other players go through that learning curve, it's treated as a natural part of development. When she went through it, it was treated as a fundamental flaw. Same process, completely different framing. And when her defensive awareness started improving, when she started anticipating passing lanes better, fighting through screens with more purpose, communicating more fluidly on rotations, the critics didn't update. They just got quieter on that particular point and found something else to highlight. That's not good faith evaluation. That's a conclusion looking for evidence. The efficiency conversation was almost identical. Early numbers showed some inefficiency. That's real. She was taking difficult shots, operating in a new system, figuring out which of her college tendencies transferred and which ones needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Efficiency wasn't always pretty, but efficiency in a vacuum is a deeply incomplete way to evaluate a player who is also doing everything else: distributing, spacing the floor, drawing defensive attention, running a team's offensive identity. There are players in this league who are extraordinarily efficient because their role is extraordinarily narrow. They catch, they shoot, they space. Clean numbers, limited responsibility. Clark's role was never that. She was being asked to do everything simultaneously from day one. And evaluating her efficiency without accounting for the weight of that responsibility is like judging a chef on the cleanliness of their station while ignoring what they're actually cooking. The numbers were always part of the picture. They were never the whole thing. And underneath all of it, running through almost every criticism, was something that rarely got named directly, a standard that shifted depending on who was being evaluated. Players with comparable statistical profiles and comparable roles got described using words like developing and building and showing flashes of. Clark got described using words like struggling and inconsistent and not living up to. Same performance level, different vocabulary. And vocabulary matters, because the words people use to describe a player shape the lens through which everyone else watches them. Once the frame is set, once the story is established, it takes enormous evidence to break it. She was providing that evidence consistently, and the frame was still holding. Here's what's actually frustrating about it. The criticism, in some ways, was doing her a disservice even when it was trying to be fair. Because legitimate analysis requires a baseline. It requires asking, compared to what? Compared to whom? At what stage of development? Under what circumstances? When those questions weren't being asked consistently, when Clark was being held to a standard that floated based on whatever the current narrative needed, the analysis stopped being useful. It stopped being about basketball. It became about something else. What that something else was, people can debate, but what's not debatable is the effect it had. It created a version of her story where success was always slightly insufficient and struggle was always confirmation, where the bar was always just slightly above wherever she was standing, and she kept clearing it anyway. That's the part that gets completely buried. She kept clearing it anyway, not with excuses, not with complaints, not by lobbying for better framing in the press or asking for a different standard publicly, just by playing. Game after game after game, through the noise and the takes and the narratives that had already decided what she was before the ball was even tipped. And slowly, Quietly, the performances started building into something the criticism couldn't easily contain anymore. Something that was getting very difficult to explain away. At some point, the conversation has to come back to the court, not the narrative, not the framing, not the think pieces and the takes, and the endless cycle of opinion dressed up as analysis. Just the basketball. Because when you actually sit down and look at what she's producing, really look at it with the right context applied, the picture that emerges is genuinely striking. And the striking part isn't just the numbers themselves. It's what those numbers cost, what they required, what had to go right, and what had to go wrong for them to exist at all. Start with the assists, because that's where the real story lives. Elite assist numbers in the WNBA don't happen accidentally. They're not a product of talent alone. They require something harder to quantify. They require teammates who trust you enough to move without the ball, to cut into traffic, to set up in uncomfortable spots because they believe the pass is coming. They require a level of offensive orchestration that only shows up when a point guard has genuinely earned the confidence of everyone around her. Clark's assist numbers weren't just impressive as raw totals. They were impressive given the developmental stage of the roster around her. She was creating opportunities out of situations that wouldn't naturally produce them, against defenses specifically designed to take her playmaking away. And she was doing it consistently enough that it stopped looking like improvisation and started looking like system. That's a different level. That's a point guard who has internalized the game deeply enough to manufacture solutions in real time. Then look at the shooting numbers with actual context applied. Range matters in this conversation, and it almost never gets discussed properly. When a shooter operates from distances that most players don't attempt, genuinely doesn't attempt, not as a highlight play but as a regular offensive option, the math changes entirely. Defenders have to cover more ground. Closeouts have to be faster. The cost of a single misrotation is higher because the punishment comes from further away, a shot that most players would never take. Converted at even a modest rate is actually more valuable than it looks on a standard efficiency chart, because the threat of it is doing work on every single possession, whether she takes it or not. Strip out the degree of difficulty. Strip out the defensive attention. Strip out the floor spacing value she generates just by standing in certain spots on the court. What remains is still a good shooting performance. Add all of that back in, it's a different conversation entirely. The turnover conversation deserves honesty too. Yes, turnovers have been part of her game. That's true, and it's fair to note. But turnovers for a primary ball handler running a team's offense are categorically different from turnovers for a player with a more limited role. More touches mean more chances for things to go wrong. More creation attempts mean more plays where the margin for error is thin. A player who never turns it over is often a player who never takes the risks that create the best opportunities. The question was never whether she turned it over. The question was whether the value of her creation outweighed the cost of her mistakes. And as her decision-making sharpened, as the reads got faster and the recognition improved, that equation started tilting clearly in one direction. The creation stayed. The costly mistakes got rarer. That's development. That's exactly what it's supposed to look like. But here's the number that almost nobody talks about enough. Games won, not her personal statistics in those games. Not whether she had a big night individually. Just how often does the Fever win when she's operating at her best? And what does a team look like when she's not? The correlation there is uncomfortable for people who want to reduce her value to a single statistical category. Because a player can put up clean numbers on a losing team and get labeled a winner if the narrative supports it. And a player can put up messy numbers on a winning team and get labeled inconsistent if the narrative has already decided. What the Fever's results showed across a real sample of games was a team that performed measurably better when she was engaged, aggressive, and operating within her expanding range of skills. That's impact, actual impact, the kind that shows up in wins, not just in individual stat lines. And then there's a thing that no number can fully capture, but that every honest basketball observer eventually has to acknowledge. The feel for the game that she was developing, the way she moved before the play developed, the way she communicated on defense, the way she signaled to teammates without the ball moving, a look, a step, a subtle shift in positioning that told everyone else on the floor exactly what was about to happen. That stuff doesn't make the box score. It rarely makes the highlight reel, but it makes teams better. It makes games easier. It's the difference between a player who performs within a system and a player who becomes a system's nervous system. The thing that sends signals to everything else and keeps it functioning at a higher level. She was becoming that. Quietly, undeniably, right in front of everyone who was paying close enough attention. And yet the public conversation was still catching up, still framing her through a lens that her actual performance had already outgrown, still asking questions that her play had already answered. That gap between what she was doing and how it was being processed was a real phenomenon, not the hype, not the drama, not the criticism. The fact that one of the most carefully watched players in the sport was somehow still operating below the radar of full recognition, still being underestimated, still being reduced, and still, every single night she stepped on that floor, making the reduction harder and harder to sustain. Step back from the individual games for a moment. Step back from the statistics and the schemes and the defensive adjustments and the efficiency debates. Step all the way back and ask a different question entirely. What does it actually mean for a sport, for a league, for an entire generation of players and fans, when someone like Caitlin Clark exists at this moment in time? Because that question has an answer, and the answer is bigger than basketball. The WNBA has been one of the most consistently undervalued products in American professional sports for most of its existence. Not because the basketball wasn't good. It was genuinely, demonstrably good, filled with elite athletes, tactical sophistication, and competitive depth that casual observers chronically underestimated because they weren't watching closely enough to know what they were missing. The problem was always reach, always visibility, always a gap between the quality of the product and the size of the audience experiencing it. That gap was real, it was persistent, and for a long time, it felt structural, like something baked into the culture that no individual player or moment could meaningfully shift. Then something started shifting anyway. The attendance numbers tell part of the story, not just Indiana's numbers, though those were striking enough on their own. The broader league numbers, road game attendance, neutral site events, the way arenas that operated at comfortable but modest capacities started filling differently when certain matchups appeared on the schedule. That's not one player's impact on one franchise. That's a rising tide. And rising tides in sports don't happen by accident. They happen when something captures attention that wasn't there before, and then holds it long enough that the audience starts coming back for its own reasons. Clark captured attention. That part was undeniable from day one. The more interesting question was always whether she could hold it, whether the casual fan who showed up because of the narrative would stay, because of the basketball. And what the data started suggesting, slowly, then unmistakably, was that they were staying. Viewership told the same story. Games featuring Clark were drawing audiences that the league hadn't consistently reached in years. Not just people who already followed women's basketball. New people, younger people, people who had a passing awareness of the WNBA but had never made an appointment viewing. That's a different kind of growth, organic growth. The kind that builds a fan base instead of just inflating a single metric. And the thing about new fans is that they're educable. They come in for one player, for one storyline, and then they discover the rest. They discover that the player they came to watch is operating in a league full of players worth watching. They develop allegiances they didn't have before. They start watching games that don't feature the player who originally brought them in. That's how sports leagues genuinely expand, not through marketing campaigns, not through broadcast deals alone. Through individual stars who serve as entry points into something larger than themselves. Clark was serving as that entry point at a scale the league hadn't experienced in a very long time. But here's where it gets genuinely complicated, because that growth brought pressure with it. Real pressure, institutional pressure. More eyes meant more scrutiny. More scrutiny meant more criticism. More criticism meant more noise around a league that had previously operated in a space where even significant controversies didn't reach mainstream sports conversation. Suddenly, everything about the WNBA was being debated by people who had watched approximately 4 games. Opinions were being formed and broadcast loudly by voices that didn't have enough context to form them well. And that created a strange dynamic. The visibility that was supposed to be good for the league was also producing conversations that felt reductive, conversations that centered on drama instead of craft, on personality instead of basketball. The players who have been in the league for years, building careers, developing their games, competing at an elite level in relative quiet, suddenly found themselves in the middle of a media environment that was louder, faster, and frequently less interested in the actual basketball than they'd ever experienced before. That tension was real. It deserved to be acknowledged honestly, and it complicated the simple narrative that more attention equals straightforward progress. Growth, it turned out, had friction, and yet, pull back further than the current season, further than the current controversy cycle, further than whatever the hot take of the week happened to be. Look at what was actually being built. Young girls watching WNBA games for the first time, youth basketball programs reporting enrollment surges, high school players watching film of professional point guard and using it to shape their own developing games, college programs seeing increased interest from recruits who now had a clearer vision of what the professional level could look like and what it could offer. That's a pipeline being rebuilt from the bottom up. That's what happens when a sport gets a genuine mainstream moment and handles it well enough that the moment extends into something sustained. Clark didn't cause all of that on her own. That would be an overstatement. The league's infrastructure, its existing players, its coaches and front offices, all of it contributed. All of it mattered. But she was the accelerant, the thing that made the moment bigger and faster and more visible than it would have been otherwise. And here's the part that should land with real weight. She was doing all of this while still getting better. This wasn't a player at her ceiling generating this kind of impact. This was a player still ascending, still finding new dimensions to her game, still building physical and mental tools that weren't fully formed yet, already operating at a level that was reshaping the sport around her, which means the question isn't what she's already done. The question is what happens when she reaches a version of herself that's still coming. What does this league look like? What does women's basketball look like when Caitlin Clark is operating at the peak of what she's capable of? That's not a rhetorical question. That's a genuine basketball question. And the answer, based on everything the trajectory suggests, is going to be something worth watching very closely. Every generation of sports fans does the same thing. The moment a player starts doing something genuinely extraordinary, the comparisons begin, almost reflexively, like the mind can't process greatness without anchoring it to something it already understands. And with Caitlin Clark, the comparisons started early, way earlier than they probably should have. But here's the thing about that. The comparisons weren't wrong because they were made. They were wrong because of which comparisons people kept reaching for, and what those choices revealed about how uncomfortable people still were with simply letting her exist in her own category. The Stephen Curry comparison surfaced almost immediately, and on the surface, it made obvious sense. Range that redefined what was considered a reasonable shot, a handle that created space in ways defenders weren't initially prepared for, a shooting motion so quick and so clean that the standard rules of closeout defense stopped applying the usual way. The aesthetic similarities were real. Nobody was making that comparison out of nowhere. But comparisons are frameworks, not verdicts. And the Curry framework, applied too rigidly, started doing something counterproductive. It started making people evaluate Clark's game against the standard of arguably the greatest shooter in NBA history, a standard that took Curry himself years of development and 2 championship runs to fully establish. That's an unfair measuring stick. Not because Clark couldn't eventually belong in that conversation, but because applying it prematurely flattened the actual story of what she was doing into a question of whether she was already there. She wasn't there yet, and that was fine. That was exactly where she was supposed to be. The Pete Maravich comparisons came from a different angle, more about the artistry, the flair, the sense that what you were watching wasn't just basketball being played well, but basketball being played in a way that felt distinct, like a specific voice in a crowded room that you could pick out without trying. Maravich was a player whose impact was felt most fully not in the moments when everything worked perfectly, but in the moments when he attempted something nobody else would even conceive of attempting. The ambition of the play was part of the point. There's something of that in Clark's game. The logo shots, the passes that travel through angles that shouldn't exist, the willingness to try things that would get almost anyone else benched. But again, the comparison, however flattering, was also a cage. It pulled the conversation toward legacy and mythology before the actual career had time to develop its own shape. Here's what the comparison game ultimately revealed. People were hungry for a framework that made Caitlin Clark make sense, that let them file her somewhere in the existing architecture of basketball greatness and move on, because the alternative, accepting that she might be genuinely new, that her specific combination of skills and timing and cultural impact didn't have a clean precedent, was harder to sit with. Novelty is uncomfortable. It requires patience. It requires watching something unfold without knowing in advance what it's going to become. And sports culture, particularly in the social media era, is deeply allergic to patience. Everyone wanted the verdict before the evidence was complete. But here's the counterintuitive truth about the legacy conversation. It's not actually too early because her career is young. It's too early because the WNBA itself is in the middle of a transformation, and the full meaning of what Clark represents can't be understood until that transformation reaches whatever's becoming. Legacy isn't just about individual statistics. It's not just about rings or MVP awards or all-star selections. Those things matter. They'll matter for her too. But legacy at its deepest level is about what's different because you existed. What changed? What became possible that wasn't before? What generation of players grew up watching you and incorporated something of your game into their own? That accounting takes time. More time than any current conversation can honestly complete. The players who will be most shaped by watching Clark play right now are probably 11, 12, 13 years old. They're in gyms somewhere, in Iowa, in Indiana, in places that have no connection to either, working on their handles, practicing deep threes, studying how she moves off the ball before the play develops, absorbing her game in a way that young players absorb the games of players they love, unconsciously and completely. Those players will enter high school with instincts they didn't get from their coaches. They'll enter college programs with skills that their predecessors didn't have at the same age. They'll arrive in the WNBA, if they get there, with a relationship to the point guard position that was partly shaped by what they spent their formative years watching. That's how legacies actually work. Not announcements, not retrospectives, not career summaries written while the career is still happening. Just influence, moving quietly through the next generation until it shows up on a court somewhere 10 years from now, and someone asks, where did that come from? And the beautiful, strange, specific thing about Clark's situation is that this is already happening while she's still playing. She doesn't have to wait for retirement for the influence to spread. It's spreading now, in real time, alongside the career itself. That's genuinely rare. Rare enough that it's worth pausing on. Most players build their legacy in retrospect. The significance becomes clear after the playing is done, when there's enough distance to see the full shape of what happened. Clark is building hers in present tense. The influence and the performance are happening simultaneously. So what does that mean for the comparisons? It means stop reaching for historical anchors and start watching what's actually in front of you, not because the comparisons are worthless. They're not. Context is useful. Historical perspective is useful. But the most honest and interesting version of this story isn't Clark as a derivative of someone who came before. It's Clark as the original. The specific, unrepeatable product of this moment, this version of the WNBA, this cultural conversation, this particular combination of skill and timing and circumstance that won't exist in exactly this form again. That's the player who is actually out there on the floor every night. Not a comparison, not a legacy waiting to be filed. Something still becoming what it's going to be. Something that, if you're watching closely, is already more remarkable than most people have found the language to describe. There comes a point in every compelling sports story where the narrative has to reckon with itself, where the noise gets quiet enough, just for a moment, that the actual truth of what's been happening can finally be heard clearly. That moment is arriving for Caitlin Clark. Not because the noise has stopped. It hasn't. It probably never fully will. But because what she's building on the court has become substantial enough that even the loudest narratives are struggling to talk over it. And that reckoning, when it fully arrives, is going to reframe everything that came before it. Think about the arc of this story from the beginning. A player arrives carrying impossible expectations, gets tested immediately and visibly, survives the testing, adapts, develops, starts doing things that the early criticism said she couldn't do, keeps doing them consistently enough that the goalpost can't move fast enough to stay ahead of her. That's not a redemption story. Redemption implies she was wrong about something. This is a different kind of story entirely. This is a story about what happens when someone refuses to let the version of themselves that exists in other people's heads become more real than the version they're actually building every day. That's harder than it sounds. Genuinely harder, because the version of Caitlin Clark that lived in public conversation was powerful. It had momentum. It had infrastructure, media cycles feeding it, social media algorithms amplifying it, opinion columns reinforcing it. That version had a story already written, already concluded, already filed. And the real Caitlin Clark, the one showing up to practice, watching film, adding dimensions to her game in the quiet spaces between the noise, had to keep producing enough evidence that the filed story couldn't hold. That's an exhausting position to be in, not just athletically, psychologically. Every player deals with criticism. Every player deals with external pressure and public doubt. That's part of professional sports at any level. But most players don't deal with it at this volume, with this much visibility, with this many people who have already decided, loudly and publicly, exactly what you are and exactly what you'll never become. The mental architecture required to perform at an elite level inside that environment is its own kind of skill, one that almost never gets credited properly. And yet, here's where the story takes the turn that matters most. All of that pressure, all of that noise and doubt and impossible expectation didn't flatten her game. It sharpened it. You can see it in how she competes. There's a quality to the way she plays that goes beyond talent or preparation. A kind of deliberate, almost defiant clarity. Like she made a decision at some point, maybe consciously, maybe not, that the external story was simply not her problem. Her problem was the next possession, the next read, the next offensive rotation. She needed to anticipate the next game, the next season. Everything else was static, and she learned, or maybe always knew, how to play through static. That quality is what separates good players from players who define eras. It's not the talent. Talent gets you to the professional level. Talent gets you minutes and opportunities and the chance to prove yourself. What keeps you there, what builds something lasting, is the ability to perform when the conditions are actively hostile, when the environment is designed, intentionally or not, to make you doubt yourself. The players who become iconic aren't the ones who had the smoothest path. They're the ones who had the hardest path and arrived anyway. Clark's path has not been smooth. By any honest accounting, it's been one of the more complicated entries into professional basketball in recent memory. Complicated not by failure, but by the sheer weight of everything surrounding the performance itself. And she has arrived anyway, not at the finish line. She's nowhere near the finish line, but at a place where the argument about whether she belongs has become genuinely difficult to sustain. So what happens next? That's the question that makes this moment so interesting. Because the trajectory she's on doesn't point toward a plateau. It points toward continued ascent. And continued ascent from where she currently stands leads somewhere that the WNBA hasn't seen in a very long time. A play at the peak of their powers, in the prime of their career, operating at a level of skill and influence that reshapes what's possible for everyone around them. That version of Caitlin Clark isn't fully here yet, but it's close enough that you can feel it coming. The teams that figure that out earliest, the franchises and coaching staffs that recognize what the trajectory is pointing toward and start preparing for it, will be in the best position when it fully arrives. The ones who are still debating whether she's actually as good as advertised, they're going to spend a lot of time catching up. And for the fans, the ones who've been watching closely, through all the noise and all the narratives and all the recycled debates, there's something genuinely exciting waiting on the other side of this moment. Because the best version of this story isn't the controversy. It's not the criticism or the defense or the endless back and forth about whether the attention is deserved. The best version of this story is the basketball. The actual basketball, played at an increasingly elite level, by a player still getting better, in a league that is growing partly because she's in it and partly because what she represents is pulling new energy into the orbit of women's basketball in ways that are going to compound over time. That's the story worth staying for, not the noise around it, the thing itself. And the thing itself, stripped of every narrative that's been layered over it, is something genuinely worth your attention. A player, a league, a moment, still unfolding, still becoming, still, somehow, despite everything, being underestimated by people who should know better by now. That won't last forever. The reckoning is coming. And when it arrives, when the full weight of what she's been quietly building finally lands in the public conversation, the way it already has in the minds of every coach and player who has had to prepare for her, it's going to land hard. The only question is whether you were paying attention before it became obvious.